The night air was colder than usual, biting through thin layers of worn clothing as Daniel pulled the frayed blanket tighter around his daughter, Emily. She was only 8 years old, small for her age, her cheeks hollow from weeks of missed meals. He kissed the top of her head as she slept in his arms on the park bench, the same one they'd called home for months now. To the world, Daniel was just another homeless single dada, broken, forgotten, invisible. But to Emily, he was everything. Daniel hadn't always been like this. Once, he had a job in construction, steady pay, and a little rented apartment that Emily filled with laughter. But when the accident happened, or when scaffolding collapsed and left him with a back injury, he lost more than just his ability to work. He lost his savings to medical bills, his apartment to overdue rent, and slowly, his hope. Emily's mother had left years before, unable to bear the struggles of raising a child. So, it was just him and his little girl against the world. He tried everything: a day labor, soup kitchens, shelter, but the city was overflowing with people like him, and the system seemed stretched to its breaking point. Some nights, Emily cried herself to sleep, asking when they'd have a real bed again. Daniel promised her soon, though he didn't know if he could keep that promise. On this particular night, Daniel noticed something strange. A group of men lingered at the far corner of the park, their voices low, their movements suspicious. He wasn't paranoid. Life on the streets taught him to read danger quickly. He shifted Emily to keep her asleep, his eyes never leaving the men. Then he saw a glint of metal under the dim streetlight. A knife. His gut clenched. He knew what was about to happen before it even began. The men weren't loitering, they were stalking. And their target was approaching from the sidewalk. A young police officer, barely out of academy, patrolling alone. The officer didn't notice the shadows moving closer, the danger tightening around him like a noose. Daniel's heart pounded. He had two choices: stay quiet and protect his daughter, or step in and risk everything. He thought of Emily. If he got hurt or killed, what would happen to her? But then he looked at the officer, oblivious and unguarded, and something inside him refused to let another life be lost, or not when he could prevent it. He stood, carefully laying Emily down with the blanket. Then he limped toward the officer, every step heavy with fear and determination. The cop noticed him and tensed, hand near his holster. "Sir, you can't," the officer began, but Daniel cut him off with a sharp whisper, his voice urgent. "Don't talk." The cop froze, confused, but Daniel's eyes told him this wasn't nonsense. He tilted his head slightly toward the shadows. The officer followed the gesture, and his expression shifted when he saw the approaching figures. Before the officer could react, one of the men lunged. Instinct took over. Daniel shoved the officer aside just as the attacker's knife slashed through the air. It grazed Daniel's arm, blood spraying across his sleeve. The cop drew his weapon, shouting commands, but the men scattered like rats into the night. Sirens followed minutes later, backup arriving to secure the area. The young officer stared at Daniel, stunned. "You saved my life," he said, his voice unsteady. Daniel winced, clutching his bleeding arm. "I just a broken bar, didn't want her to see something worse than she already has," he whispered, glancing toward Emily, still asleep on the bench. The officer's gaze softened as he followed Daniel's eyes. A little girl, sleeping in the cold night, wrapped in a blanket that had seen better days. Something cracked in the young man's heart. Within the hour, paramedics patched Daniel's arm. The officer stayed close, refusing to let him fade into the background like just another nameless homeless man. He asked questions, learned Daniel's story, listened as Daniel spoke quietly about losing everything but still trying to hold on to hope for Emily. Word spread quickly among the precinct about the homeless man who had risked his life for one of their own. Some dismissed it as luck, but others, especially the officer whose life was saved, saw more than luck. They saw courage. A week later, Daniel and Emily were brought before a gathering at the station. The police chief himself shook Daniel's hand, thanking him publicly for his bravery. The officer who'd been attacked stood beside him, insisting Daniel deserved more than words. "He risked his life when he had nothing left to lose," the officer said, voice thick with emotion. "That's not something you forget." The community began to notice. Local news picked up the story, painting Daniel not as a vagrant but as a hero. Donations poured in, not just to him, but to shelters across the city. A businessman saw the segment and offered Daniel a job light work that wouldn't strain his injury. Others chipped in to help him and Emily find housing. The night Daniel carried Emily across the threshold of their small but warm apartment, he nearly broke down. She giggled as she jumped on the bed, her very own bed, and he whispered, "See, baby girl, I told you soon." Emily hugged him tight. "You're my hero, Daddy." Tears blurred his vision. "No, sweetheart, you're mine." But the story didn't end there. Daniel became a quiet symbol in the community, volunteering when he could, speaking at shelters about resilience, hope, and the strength it took to keep going. The officer often visited, sometimes sharing dinner with them, sometimes just checking in. A bond had been forged in that dark park, a bond stronger than fear, forged in sacrifice. Years later, when Emily grew up, she never forgot the night her father stood between danger and a stranger. That moment taught her something no classroom ever could, that true humanity shines brightest in the darkest moments. And for Daniel, the man who had lost everything, he discovered that kindness, courage, and selflessness could rebuild a life here, not just his own, but those around him. Because sometimes, it takes a man who has nothing left to remind the world of everything that truly matters.